Good day and welcome to EASC 418, and today we're talking about commonly misused words. So commonly mistaken words, particularly homonyms, which is the focus of this first part of our lecture. And you may recall that homonyms are words that sound the same and they can have entirely different meanings, or in some cases they have fairly similar meanings, which is why they're extra easy to confuse. So I'll be going through some slides, giving some definitions to differentiate between the two words that often get confused. And my reference for anything on the following slides is this big dictionary here. This is the New Lexicon Webster's Dictionary, 1988 edition. And in fact, this dictionary has an entire section on words often confused and misused. So that's chapter 6. And this chapter has a number of different words that are often misused and confused. I'll be going through the ones that are particularly common in technical reports in earth and environmental science. So words like effect and affect, which happen to appear in all sorts of reports and often get confused. So with that, let's get into the PowerPoint and start going through some of these words. So as I mentioned, we'll start with homonyms. This is lecture 3A. Part 3B will be words with similar meanings. So words that have relatively similar meanings but sound differently, though they're often confused. A good example is which versus that, or IE versus EG, and we'll go through all of those. And then words that are often misused in common language, although it doesn't really make too much difference. We know what we're talking about. The people that we're talking to can understand it even if we make these errors. But in technical language, we want to be very precise and not make these types of errors. So we'll go through these as well. So let's start with some of the homonyms and go through some of the words that sound the same and are often confused, though they mean quite different things. Before I go into these, I'm going to just say a couple of things about Canadian English. So here in Canada, we have a mixture of Canadian and British English. I'm showing some words on the right that have both British and American spellings. Have a look at these words. Do you recognize which is the American versus which is the British? I can tell you that I recognize some of these as being Canadian or American or British, but for the most part, I can read and write these words without knowing the difference. And I'll just tell you that the words on the left are American, the ones on the right are British. A lot of dictionaries that have Canadian spellings will allow either of these as being correct English spelling. So I'm not going to mark English versus British. Sometimes you'll be writing in some sort of a publication, a journal article, or a technical document, and you'll have a style guide, and it will tell you to use either British or English. However, for the purposes of this course, I don't really care. You can use either. I'm not going to mark you incorrectly because Canadian English is too ambiguous when it comes to American versus British. So you don't need to worry about American and English. That's the good news. The bad news is that you're probably using a spell checker, and your spell checker will tell you that either one of these is correct or incorrect, depending on whether you've got it set to Canadian, British, or US. So check that and be careful if your spell checker is telling you that you're spelling, say, traveler incorrectly. You might actually be spelling it correctly, but your spell checker is trying to make you become an American speaker or writer. So be careful about that. Okay, so let's get into the homonyms. The first, and I would say the most important from an environmental science perspective, is these two. We use these two words a lot. So affect is a verb meaning to influence. Effect is a noun indicating a result or an outcome. So I've shown some examples in the right here. The calcium carbonate content in a river has no effect on its pH. You'll see something like that all the time, and it's incorrect. The calcium carbonate content in a river will affect its pH. So in this case, affect is a verb. In the second case, I'm again starting with an incorrect usage. The biologist detected multiple ways that smog affected the monarch butterfly. This is incorrect. Smog affected, so I'm using a noun as a verb here. It's incorrect. So the correct version is the biologist assessed the effects of smog on the monarch butterfly. So in this case, assessed is the verb, affects is the noun. So you need to be very careful with this one. I think it's just a matter of using it a lot and getting used to it. Here's a set of 3 words that sound fairly similar: assure, insure, and insure. These are often used incorrectly, particularly in proposals, where in a proposal we are trying to convince somebody that we are going to do a good job for them, whether it's a grant proposal or a job proposal or any other type of proposal. We want to give them some assurance that we're going to do a good job. We might tell them that we can ensure something will happen. And in this case, we better have good insurance if we make these insurances or assurances, because in fact, it's very risky to try and insure something. Insure being the ENSUR version of that word. Okay, so let's go through these one at a time. So assure is to tell as a certain fact, or to give assurance, or to reassure. So I'm going to assure you that something can happen. The correct word here is, you don't need to assure me, just show me the data. We often don't use the word assure in technical writing because it implies that we need to convince somebody of something. We should let the data do the convincing for itself, and we can just provide an interpretation of the data. But to me, the word assure means we're too heavily personally invested in something. So we almost never see this word in technical writing. The next word we do see often when we shouldn't see it. So insure, to make certain of getting or achieving. So I said, use with extreme caution. Few things can actually be insured in this way. So I've written the sentence on the right in red. Even though it's grammatically correct, it's just something we should try and avoid saying. You might see this in a proposal. In completing the proposed work, we will ensure the highest quality deliverable. So the reason we want to avoid this is because we can't possibly ensure that. We can't make this happen. We can try, we can do our best, but we can't actually ensure it. So if we're proposing this to somebody, whether again it's a grant proposal or a consulting proposal, or you're proposing something to your professor, if you've used this kind of language where you'll ensure it, that means you will do absolutely everything possible in order to make that happen. And so what we're doing here is we're setting ourselves up for failure. And in some cases, if it's got some money attached to our proposal, we're actually potentially setting ourselves up for some legal ramifications. So unless you're very sure that this is the correct use of the word, be very careful about using insure, and most of the time just avoid it. The last one is pretty straightforward as long as we're using this word correctly. Insure, to purchase insurance. We all go down to the insurance bureau, purchase insurance. We insure our cars. And if you plan to open a consulting firm, it will cost you a lot to insure your business. It's just a typical everyday thing. So as long as we're using the word insure properly, no problem. If we have insurance, we can say we will insure the work. Next one, continual versus continuous. These are very similar. The main difference here is that if something is continual, it has pauses or interruptions, whereas if something is continuous, it occurs without pause. So I've shown 2 fairly similar examples here. The weather station recorded wind speed continually in 15-minute increments. The passive sampler was exposed to the contaminant continuously for 3 months as the air passed through the membrane. So in the first example, the weather station is taking a discrete measurement every 15 minutes with a pause in between. In the second, it's a passive sampler that's sitting out in the landscape and some substance is moving through a membrane, but there's no pause in between. It's continuously moving through. Next, farther versus further. So farther only means distance. Further is to some degree or extent, but not with respect to distance. So Uranus is further from Mars than Earth is. That's incorrect. Uranus is farther from Mars than Earth is. And the other example I've given here, no further information can be obtained from the samples that were destroyed during shipping. We wouldn't say no farther information. That one actually sounds pretty incorrect as soon as we say it. It's that first example where we might say something is further away. It's not further away, it's farther away. Okay, so that one's a little bit subtle. Okay, this next one confuses a lot of people. We often see these written incorrectly in technical writing. So we have two words, historic and historical. They look similar, they sound similar, and they in fact mean fairly similar things, but there's a key difference. So they both relate to events in the past. The first is associated with famous events in the past. So think of the term historic monument or historic event. The second, historical, has taken place in the past, but it's not a legendary event. This is normally the correct word that we will use in scientific writing. So we have historical databases, we have historical data sets. We use a lot of different historical data. If you think of a weather station at an airport, for example, it will have a historical data set. So the incorrect sentence here is the historic record of precipitation revealed periods of severe drought. A very similar and correct sentence is the historical record of precipitation revealed periods of severe drought. So we see this one written incorrectly all the time. Take a look at the second sentence. Does it look right to you? I'm going to let you think about that for a minute. I did put a trick in there. There is a second error. I spelt drought incorrectly. We see this one incorrectly all the time. And in fact, the first time I typed the sentence myself, I spelt it incorrectly and I had to look at it and think about that word. So the first one is draft and the correct spelling here is drought. So be careful with the word drought. Next, the meter. This is often spelled incorrectly. It's actually pretty easy to remember this one if you think that meter is a metric term and it has the first four letters spelled exactly the same as metric. Okay, so a meter is an instrument that measures something if it's spelled M-E-T-E-R. So an ohm meter, any sort of meter that you would hold in your hand to measure something is a meter, M-E-T-E-R. The distance meter measured a distance of 1 meter. Next, principle and principle. These are often interchanged incorrectly, and both of these terms are used frequently in technical writing. So principle, something that is most important, an amount of money invested, often not used in technical writing, but the key thing here is that this first spelling of the word principle has three fairly different meanings, the third being a head of a school or a firm. So when you went to school, grades 1 to 12, you almost certainly had a principal and a vice principal. Okay? The other type of principle is something that you would have learned about in virtually all of your introductory science courses. They're all based on principles. A law, basic truth, rule of conduct, or guidance. So I've used principle a few different ways here on the right. Although our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, the principal element is oxygen because it sustains aerobic life. So in this sentence, principle means the most important thing or the most important element. So the principal or most important. Second, in my former job, my title was Principal Environmental Chemist. So true fact, that was actually my title. And the third is the concentration of nitrogen lost to outer space was estimated by the principle of mass balance. So in this case, the principle is some sort of a rule, basic truth, or some sort of a guidance. So we use that principle. There are a few more listed here. I'll leave these to you to go and read these on the sites that I've linked to. These are all important, but they're more just sort of standard grammar. And particularly the first one, we went over that one last week, so hopefully you remember the proper use of the apostrophe in the word its. But also pay attention to these, lie versus lay, proceed versus precede, than and then, who and whom. Okay, so check out the link on the blog site. It links to a few different sites that list a bunch of these different homonyms that are easily confused, and you should be familiar with all of the ones linked on those sites. I went through the ones that appear most commonly in technical writing, so you can expect that the quizzes will focus on these. but all of the words that are linked on these other pages are English that we need to get correct in technical writing. So they're all fair game, so please spend some time making sure you know all of them. Okay, talk to you soon.